So try and intervene as little as possible. That's why I say we try and do the entire process as naturally as possible. And that goes from the vineyards. So in the vineyards, we don't use any insecticides. We're forced to use sort of sulfur, which is, I suppose, used in all winemaking, in the vineyard spraying, but sulfur is a natural element. And it's a preservative that's been used in wine for generations.
Justin, but it's so lovely to meet you here on Zoom.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to have a chat.
Yeah, and you're winemaker at Constantia Glen.
That's correct.
Yeah, and how long have you been there?
I've been here for since 2008. So what's that? 14 years.
Wow. Yeah. But tell me, how did your career start as a winemaker? Was it something you were interested in as a child, or how did you?
Yes, sure. So actually, I went to high school here in Cape Town, and during my grade 11 year, we have to do some job shadow, and I was very fortunate to do that actually on Constantia wine estate in the vineyards. I had friends of mine who actually lived right on the estate, and they knew the previous farm manager, Kali. They knew him very well. So I did some back work in the vineyards, or some shadow work with Kali in the vineyards, and that was in 2002. And then I matriculated in 2003, and I really enjoyed the experience. And I come from a farming background. My family are actually merino sheep farmers in the Karoo. So I always wanted to do something in agriculture, but I quite enjoyed the life in Cape Town. So I wanted to be Cape Town based and not 5 hours from Cape Town. Yeah. So I thought it was a good opportunity. And so I really enjoyed it, and then found out about the course that Stellenbosch University offers. So I enrolled at Stellenbosch in 2004 to study viticulture and enology. Yeah. And I haven't looked back, to be honest. I've
really
enjoyed it. Yeah.
Amazing. But growing up on a merino farm, did you have any sort of knowledge before that, or any idea of what winemaking is about?
No, not at all. No. Not at all. My only knowledge of wine, I suppose, growing up was, the bottles that were on the table. And in South Africa at that time, it was mainly the Rödeberg from KWV. It was always on the table, and my parents and grandparents, they always encouraged us to have a taste of wine. We were always allowed to from a young age. Don't know if I can say that, but it was, and so no, absolutely no knowledge. And even, I think, when I was at school in Cape Town, that's the first time that you're exposed to the winelands, and I suppose you are attracted to the beauty and the sort of romance of winemaking at a young age. And I just and then when I studied it at university, I've got quite a sort of I appreciate science and chemistry, and it just worked very well for me, and I particularly enjoyed the sort of chemistry part of it.
Yeah, this is interesting that you say now about the science part of it, and that was your interest. So, but now I'm trying to find out or I've read this article that winemaking is as much an art as it is a science. Did you find that when you started making wine as well?
I think to answer your question is when you start out, you very much, I think you're attracted to the artistic side, but obviously throughout all our studies at university, it's all a Bachelor of Science, it's all science. You get an amazing, and also when I start out winemaking, I felt like you are applying a lot of the scientific principles and everything that you've learned at university. But now that I'm more than a decade into winemaking, I start, I see a lot more of the art behind winemaking. I really do. I think, and the art, it's something that it takes time. So it takes many years to understand your vineyards, and you start being able to, you sort of understand your vineyards, you understand your wine style a lot better. And I would say, to answer your question, I think starting out was very much a scientific application. Now it's a lot of like artistic sort of application, and especially towards blending and so forth. I mean, obviously the scientific principles are there and they're ingrained in us, and ensuring that wine is made hygienically, meaning that, wine has to be, there's a certain amount of science involved to make sure that it remains healthy. That's really all winemakers are doing, is they're trying to make grapes rot in a scientifically correct way so that it produces a good beverage. That's really what we're doing. So there's a lot of artistry that goes into that.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's almost like you have to know the rules or you have to learn the rules to break them, or something like that.
Yeah. I've got small children, and they always say that every time they smell like fermenting juice, they just think it's awful. This is like it's rotting. Then say it's fizzy and it's rotting.
But that is the interesting part, I think, is to see how nature also, in this like you say, in this rotting process, that how nature has this natural way of producing wine.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Now, so with all this scientific knowledge that you have, how much do you intervene in the process, and how much do you prefer to keep natural?
So try and intervene as little as possible. That's why I say we try and do the entire process naturally as possible. And that goes from the vineyards. So in the vineyards, we don't use any insecticides. We're forced to use sort of sulfur, which is, I suppose, used in all winemaking in the vineyard spraying. But sulfur is a natural element, and it's a preservative that's been used in wine for generations. So, so in terms of the winemaking, all our red wines are naturally fermented in the cellar, because the wine is fermenting in contact with the grape skins. We want the yeast that is outside in the vineyards, we want those yeasts to actually populate the fermentation medium. And so we do all our red wines with natural alcoholic fermentation, so no commercial yeast is added to those. And I try and interfere as little as possible when it comes to winemaking, call it that. There's a lot that one can add, during maturation of wine, for example, or trying to mature wine in stainless steel tanks with staves and so forth. But we are very much, we're very traditional in the sense that we ferment our wines naturally in stainless steel tanks, and then the wine goes down into barrels and it's left to mature for 18 months. And we don't try and fiddle with the wines before bottling. We try and express the vineyards, and we try and express the vintage. And as soon as one starts fiddling with, whether it be additions of some sweetness at the end, or whether it be fining agents, I believe that makes wine more generic, and it'll not express the vintage. I'm quite proud of the fact, for example, that the 2019 vintage, the wines display a lot more elegance and finesse, whereas the 2018 vintage expresses the sort of power and sort of the heat of the vintage, should I say. So every vintage is different, and I think it's important that the wines display these natural occurrences in nature. I find that very important.
But do you have at this point also a way of predicting what the wines would be like, or if you say the different years of vintage and the weather, the climate, is there some way you predict?
Yes, we can predict. But I steer away from trying to predict the quality or the style of a vintage before the wines are actually vinified and in barrel. I try and steer away from that. One's always very inclined before one picks the grapes that you already think, oh, it's a cool vintage, but so much can change during the harvest season. That just showed this year, for example. We had this very cool growing season. It was incredibly cool up until New Year's Day, basically, until the 1st of January. And then in February, we had quite a number of heat spikes, and which changed everything. I think it would have been quite a different vintage had the cool summer remained in place. And fortunately, we had the bit of heat because it got the ripening going a bit faster. Otherwise, we would have probably still been harvesting today.
Really?
Had we not had some heat. It was an extremely late vintage, 2022. We started on the 28th of February, which is a good, I would say, 8 days later than we would normally start. But we didn't actually finish 8 days later. We actually finished probably 4 or 5 days earlier than some of our later vintages. So it was a very condensed harvest because of the few very warm days we had in February and March.
So, but now, how much in situations like that where the weather is not exactly as it's supposed to be, how do you then do you have less grapes? Do you have more grapes? Or what would these cool temperatures do to the quality of the wine?
I think the quantity of grapes has already been decided really early on in this year. Okay. It's actually decided, by your winter pruning and then the berry set during flowering or after flowering. So it's not so much that, but it does. The coolness affects the breakdown of the acidity. So obviously, as the grapes form, they're these key very, very small berries, and they are just all acid, zero sugar. And basically, through veraison, the sugars accumulate in the berries, and the acid goes down. So in cool vintages, the acidity remains in place very well. And we did experience that. So this vintage, we had some phenomenal acidities. And that's another thing here at Constantia Glen is it's all natural acidity. We do not, because of our cool climate location, we don't need to ever add any acidity, which is fantastic. And except, for example, sometimes on the red grapes in a very warm vintage, we might be forced to do that, but certainly the last couple of vintages it has not been required. So it's small things such as that, but I think if one can make wine a place where grapes grow optimally means that there should be very little intervention in the final winemaking procedure.
And now, how much do you experiment?
We experiment a lot. So we continually experimenting. I think if one's not, experimenting with winemaking, then you're never learning. So we do a lot of experimentation. Once again, in the vineyard, we do experimentation on sort of vineyard management practices. Which I think are the most rewarding ones, because you can the influence on style is I think the biggest influence that one can do is actually in the vineyards, and then in the cellar we experiment a lot with maturation vessels, particularly on our white wines. We mainly use, or in the past we mainly used French oak barrels. We've now started experimenting with Austrian oak, French acacia. We've got quite a few clay amphora for fermentation and maturation. So, and these clay vessels are phenomenal vessels. I think they are certainly something that I'm very excited about. And I find the clay, we actually have these very large 600-liter clay pots, and they allow oxygen to integrate into the wine, similar to a barrel, but I would say a lot less than a barrel. But obviously without any oak tannin and any oak lactone flavors. So it's a very neutral vessel, but it does give you more character than stainless steel, for example. So fantastic vessels, I think. Yeah. And and then we continually experimenting with doing yeast trials. So on Sauvignon Blanc, we produce a lot of Sauvignon Blanc in Constantia, and today is actually International Sauvignon Blanc Day.
Okay.
And and we even collectively within the Constantia Valley, so myself and Bulla from Constantia and Donnie from Constantia, we're actually doing an experiment where we all trialing on a batch of Sauvignon Blanc, we're trialing 3 different yeast types, just so that we can sort of have a broader experiment that we can then analyze the final wines and taste the final wines to actually determine what are the best yeast, commercial yeast types for Sauvignon Blanc from our region. So it's continually experimenting in order to learn and improve. Basically, we have to continually strive for to produce better wine, and I think I really enjoy the aspect of being able to do that collectively as a region rather than just doing it by myself.
Yeah. And but you're mentioning now about the clay pots, and I think that this was also originally, wasn't it, where wine was kept in?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I mean, I think clay amphora were used for winemaking a long time before oak barrels. I think oak barrel, the wine making was done in clay, and then oak barrels came about as a means of transporting wine. So the clay pots were obviously buried underground, and you couldn't move them around. And the barrels came about because of for wine to be shipped around the world. At the time, they were shipped in these oak barrels, and then they actually found that the wine got a lot better from when it was loaded onto the ship when it got to its destination. And then that's when it came about. I realized, well, actually, these oak barrels actually enhance the wine. They actually contribute positively towards the maturation of the wine, and that's why oak barrels became the sort of best maturation vessels that we have. But in terms of vinification, clay pots or clay amphora is where it all started, and it's a fantastic vessel. I actually compare it, especially the ones that I'm working with. It's very close to a glass jar. I mean, these clay amphora are fired in a kiln, which is at 420 degrees Celsius or something. So they really are fantastic vessels. And a lot less oxidative than concrete vessels, for example. I think concrete allows a lot more oxygen ingress into the wine, whereas the clay pots are more similar to glass, I would say. Yeah.
But I was thinking if the clay wouldn't then add minerals to the wine because of the clay itself.
Yeah, I don't, because it's fired in a kiln.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I don't see anything. I don't see any imparting of any minerals from the clay.
Okay, so it's not
concrete. I think there'd probably be more of an impact from the concrete. Yeah, because that hasn't actually. Yeah, it hasn't been treated, should I say? Yeah.
So the clay would not be the vessels that you mature the wine in. So it will still be matured in wood then.
No, sorry, I'm saying that's how it would have been done hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
We do mature. So I've only got 5 clay pots, and we vinify in the pots, and we leave the wine to mature in those same vessels for up to a year. Yeah, and that's on white wine, Sauvignon Blanc, and Semillon. Yeah.
Okay. And now these yeast that you're talking about that you add, these artificial yeast, then is that only for the white wine?
That's only for white wine, yeah.
And what is the reason that you have to add that to the white wine and that you can't use the natural yeasts?
So, one could use natural yeast for producing white wine. It is possible, and I have done experimentation with doing natural fermentation on Semillon, for example. So Semillon has slightly lower acidity and a slightly higher pH than Sauvignon Blanc. The reason for using commercial yeast on our Sauvignon Blanc fermentations is that we want to ferment our Sauvignon Blanc at a rather cool temperature, so a temperature of about 13 to 14 degrees Celsius. The colder temperature preserves those primary aromas. And in order to ferment at this cooler temperature, commercial yeast, I don't like the word artificial yeast, because a commercial yeast is still a yeast. It's still the same organism. So if one looks at it under the microscope, it's no different from a natural yeast. And in fact, commercial yeast is, it's harvested, or it's populated in the laboratory, but from a naturally occurring yeast somewhere in a vineyard. So it just means it's available in a packet, and you can inoculate the yeast. But inoculated yeast or commercial yeast is you can basically achieve your desired wine style with much greater accuracy. And for me, the biggest thing is using it on Sauvignon Blanc, for example, to achieve a certain wine style, but also to achieve a much cooler fermentation temperature. The other difference is that Sauvignon Blanc, certainly our Sauvignon Blanc, has a very low pH, a pH of 3 or 3.1. And this low pH juice makes it very hard for natural yeast to actually complete, or even to populate the medium and actually complete the fermentation. So very often a commercial yeast is required. Whereas, for example, the red wines that we use naturally occurring yeast that they come in from the vineyard, the pH of those juices would be about 3.5, 3.6, so much higher in pH. And also, red wine fermentation temperatures are much warmer. So you actually, with red wines, where you want to extract flavor and tannin from the grape skins, you actually want red wine fermentations to run at about 25 and peak even at 28 degrees Celsius, which is optimal temperatures for yeast to perform their job. And their job is really to convert sugar to alcohol. And all the byproducts of yeast fermentation are obviously the fantastic flavors and mouthfeel. Some yeasts use more mouthfeel and texture than others. But yeah, that's I think the biggest reason why we do it, why we add commercial yeast to Sauvignon Blanc and not to the other varieties.
Okay, yeah.
Certainly the red ones, yeah.
But now tell me about the history of this farm, because you're in the same area as Constantia, Groot Constantia. I've spoken to Bula as well.
Okay.
But what is the history of the Constantia Glen farm?
Sure. So obviously, Groot Constantia is the epicenter of the history of Constantia. Where we are located on the Constantiaberg, we're basically from Groot Constantia, you travel up Constantia Main Road in the direction of Hart Bay, and we're basically on what is called the Vlakkenberg or Flag Mountain, but it's fairly high up on the slopes. The farm starts at the bottom. It's at 140 meters above sea level, all the way to 280 meters above sea level.
Wow.
And the farm actually used to be called Glen Alpine. So it used to be very much a forest. And it is thought that certainly in the times of the 16 and 1700s, that this would have been used for grazing cattle and so forth. It was never used as land for viticulture or for planting vineyards. Anyway, the farm was bought in 1960 by the Weibel family. So they're an Austrian family. They bought this property as a home base for starting a textile business in South Africa. So they bought the farm with no intention to ever farm it. It was very much just a place for them to grow their families and to have a base in Cape Town. And it took until about the mid-90s for them to, in the mid-90s, they were sort of starting to think about, oh, well, we actually have some beautiful slopes. They started sort of toying with the idea of planting vineyards. But actually in 1995, they had a Red Angus cattle stud on the property. So there were a bit of the forest was cleared for the cattle, for pastures. And then in December of 99, there was a very bad wildfire that burned through this entire area, actually from Cape Point through the Constantia Mountain, over the Flackenberg onto Table Mountain. So that fire destroyed a lot of the vegetation in this area. And it was actually with this fire that they really saw the extent of the entire property and the slopes. And obviously, following this fire, a lot of the debris had to be cleared. And it was, I think this fire was really it was the catalyst that just made the vineyard planting happen much faster. Because once the land was cleared, in order to prevent erosion, something had to be done with the land. And winemaking dates back to 1685. So it was the obvious choice. And it happened rather quickly. So the vineyards were then planted on Constantia Glen, the first couple in the year 2000, and the majority 2001, and the final vineyards were planted in 2002. So 20 years ago, the farm was planted, and then the winery where I'm sitting now, the winery was built in 2006, and the first wines were produced in the cellar in 2007.
That is so incredible. So it's a very young farm then in comparison.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we're definitely one of the newer producers in the valley. And in fact, this, ourselves and our neighbors, Eagle's Nest and Constantia, are all three properties that are sort of, call it, on the northern slopes of the northeast facing slopes of the Constantia Mountain, whereas the rest of Constantia is all on the south and southeast facing slopes. So we're quite high up on against Constantia Neck, and all three of the properties were all planted subsequent to those fires in December of 99. Yeah,
that's so interesting. But it's, you know what, it's the story of this. If you think of it, that the fire from the fire that destroyed actually came this wonderful winery now. Yeah,
no, it's amazing. And I think, to be honest, I think that there was always a plan to start planting some vineyards, but I think the plan was very much for sort of 10 hectares. And with a fire burning, call it, all the forest vegetation on the property, it quickly became, we actually have 30 hectares that can be planted. So today we've actually got, it's 28.5 hectares on Constantia Glen, and everything is planted to Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon as the white varieties, and then to the 5 Bordeaux red varieties. So Constantia Glen is completely focused on growing Bordeaux varieties and also producing Bordeaux-style wines in Constantia. So we produce a Sauvignon Blanc and then a Constantia White, as I call it, which is a blend of Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon. And then 2 Bordeaux-style reds which are the Constantia Glen 3, which is a blend of Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and Cabernet Sauvignon. And the 5 is it's called Constantia Glen 5 because it's all 5 Bordeaux varieties, and that's driven by Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc, and it's got Merlot, Petit Verdot, and Malbec.
Wow!
And all estate grown and produced and bottled on the estate. Yeah.
That's amazing. But
Yeah.
and do you have a bottle there? What does your label look like?
So the
Yeah.
Constantia Glen, you can see that.
Oh, that's
And it
wonderful.
actually,
Yeah.
it's very simple,
Yeah.
and it hasn't changed since the very beginning. So the first wine that was bottled was actually in 2005. We produced our first Sauvignon Blanc, so that's the Sauvignon Blanc, and it hasn't changed. The design of the label has remained identical from then until now. It's never changed.
Wow. But that's wonderful. And you say the owners are Austrian.
The owners, it's an Austrian family.
Yeah.
And they, so I mean, their family have actually owned the property since 1960. So I think it must be, in terms of Constantia wine farm and privately owned, certainly for the longest period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Justin, this is so interesting. And I mean, I think this is so wonderful that they did this and that they, that they developed this farm and this winery. And it's actually a very short period of time where all these things happened.
Yeah, I'm also I'm very glad that it happened, because I get to make wines in I think one of the most beautiful parts of the world. And I think, it's an extremely beautiful place to work, but also it's a very unique location. Constantia Glen is, because we're part of this very cool climate Constantia region, but the soils and the aspects are slightly different from the valley. So it's really got a very unique location. And I think the property is probably one of the pristine areas to grow Bordeaux varieties in South Africa. So it's an honor to work here. And we got to just, as you say, we've only been around for 20 years.
Yeah.
The wines have actually only been around for about 15 years. And we've achieved a certain amount of sort of awards and sort of market recognition. But I think it's, the idea is to continue striving for excellence in what we produce.
Yeah. So, and your family, they don't want you back to come do merino farming?
I have two brothers. So my older brother.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. So my older brother is actually on the merino farm in Beaufort West, between Beaufort West and Prince Albert, and he's got a wife and two children, and they very happy on the farm. And then I've also got a younger brother who's actually an engineer. So we've got a farmer and a winemaker and an engineer.
Yeah, that's very convenient. Wow. But now, Justin, what is your wish for the future?
Wow, my wish for the future. My wish, I think, I'm very settled where I am. And I think my wish certainly for the South African wine industry is that we sort of start picking up or getting a defined regional identity. For me, it's like France or Europe. They've got this very very focused regional identity, and I think in South Africa previously. It was all about diversity, and it still is. And we've got the most amazing, diverse floral kingdom. And but really, I think in regions, there's still a very there's a lot of differentiation about which varieties work well in certain regions. And I think that it's slowly starting to, should I say, it's slowly starting to form. There's the sort of regional identity, and I think and so coming with that means that regions can start working together to promote their region collectively rather than separately. So that's I think where we're heading.
Yeah, well, but it's like you say, you're already collaborating on the farms in that area, and that working together. And I mean, I think also for the soil and the whole ecosystem that's there, that it's also important that farmers, or that the wine farming industry think together in terms of that.
Yes. And there's a lot of that happening as well. We're actually doing a terroir study with Vinpro over the next few years, and there's a lot that's being done in terms of, as you say, with diversity, and there's the shift. Another sort of shift is that the whole region can start farming sustainably. Should I say? We all. So one thing in Constantia, for example, is that all the 9 properties in Constantia already a number of years ago decided we control insects biologically, no spraying of insecticides. So our biggest insect problem is from mealybug, and we now control that purely with natural predators. So basically wasps and cryptolemus to actually control mealybug biologically rather than spraying insecticide. And I think it's just our duty. We're farming vineyards in a suburban area, really. We're surrounded by suburbia in Constantia. So that was an obvious choice. And now I think, to move to the soil and actually looking after soil health by using sustainable farming methods. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the awareness also from the public, or from the consumer, is become greater. And I think this is, I personally also think that businesses or wineries educate this way, that by doing that, by setting the example, people are getting more aware of it anyway. So
yes,
I think it's great. Yeah. But I just have one last question for you. Can you do a shout out for a restaurant or a coffee shop in your area that you visit regularly?
That I visit regularly. Yes, absolutely. Well, it's actually one of our neighbors, but the coffee block at Buitenverwachting, one of our neighboring farms. And just a shout out, they do some of the most amazing coffee in Constantia. So a shout out to the coffee block.
Oh, okay, great. So do you go there frequently?
Yes, we frequent the coffee block probably a bit more than the fine dining restaurant.
Is it?
But that's beyond the restaurant is also fantastic. Yeah.
Okay.
It's called Beyond, and it's beyond expectation.
Oh, okay, that's great. Yeah, that's a lovely name. A lovely name for a restaurant. Yeah.
Yeah.
But Justin, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks, Petra. Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Yeah,
it was great chatting to you.
Yeah, and so interesting. Honestly, I think the more I speak to winemakers, the more I realize things that I've never realized before about wine. So I think it's interesting. Yeah.